Let's just get started and let folks trickle in as they trickle in here. Today for me is a little bit different. We're running into the back half of this particular program in this particular series here. And today begins mental health and mental well-being, something that's in the news. I don't know if that's me hissing or the microphone hissing, but if I'm a little snake-like today, then we'll be good. Okay, you can't hear it? I can for some reason. That's weird. Maybe I'm just snake-like in my own head. Who knows? So, mental health and well-being is in my wheelhouse. That's the water that I bathe in. That's the space that I live in as a therapist, as a coach, as a writer, as a theologian, as a pastor. And so I want you here to learn what's important to you, but I also want you to be able to ask the questions that are important to you about mental health and well-being, because this is a pretty serious subject nowadays, especially coming on the heels of, 20 months into a pandemic. Now we're in the endemic phase in many ways, the how do we learn to live with what's new versus all this stuff is new and chaotic. And that's going to impact mental health and well-being. And so I want to spend part of the time talking about a couple terms. I want to share a couple stories with you. But I'd really, as you're kind of listening and absorbing to some extent, feel free to ask a question. You know, if you've never asked a therapist a question outside of therapy, feel free to ask that question. If it's, what are you thinking when we're talking to you? Ask the question. Because I don't want that process to be shrouded in any way in some kind of mystery or otherness, because then it makes it harder to access. And so we'll have some time for that at the end here, and I would love for you, whatever your curiosity is, whatever you imagined that you thought it was like that has kept you from stepping into it, ask it. No shame, no nothing. There's no question that's too elementary or too basic. And if I can answer it, I will, and if I can't, I'll try to find it for next week. So the story I want to start off with today is the story out of Mark 5. And it begins with Jesus stepping off a boat and encountering a man who lives in a tomb area. It's the story of the Gerasene demoniac is what it's called in Mark. So it's the one that kicks off the chapter there. And the way that Mark tells the story, or the author of Mark tells the story, is that this man lives in the tomb basically because his community can't stand him and they can't control him any longer. They've tried to bind him with chains and shackles, but he shouts too loud and he's too strong and he breaks the chains. The story is also told in Luke. And so it's kind of reinforced in Luke, and there it talks about the man who rips his clothes and won't keep clothes on his body. And the reason why I start with that story is I want to tell you a story of my own about my grandfather. My grandfather was bipolar, and bipolar in the 50s and in the 60s when we didn't understand what bipolar was. He had very large mood swings, very deep depressions, and he was hospitalized a couple of times for that depression. Electroconvulsive therapy, which was the big therapy at the time, and it actually has come back to some extent about resetting the brain and how the brain's chemicals and neurons fire. They're a little more compassionate in the way they apply it today. Back in the 50s, it was bite this belt and we're going to send shocks through your brain. And so during his first episodes and hospitalization, he was an elder at a Presbyterian church. And when he left the hospital and showed up for a session meeting, he found out that the session had chosen to relieve him of his duties as an elder. Basically kicked him off of the session because of a mental illness. They didn't talk to him. They didn't ask him. They didn't say a word to him. They just told him, for your own good, we'd like for you not to be here anymore. They bound his ministry. They shackled his faith and sent him to the tomb. All because they were scared. They didn't understand. They didn't know how to interact, to relate, to intersect with someone experiencing depression, experiencing mania. And I dare say the church has changed much in those years, because it really hasn't. We may have a more nuanced academic understanding of mental illness. We may read about it more in the papers and hear about it, but we still don't actively fight against the idea that people who are violent are mentally ill. We carry that stigma with us. And that's a huge word today to think about. When we think about all of the conversations that we're having about racial injustice, about sexuality and gender identity, and the ways in which we're trying to accept and bring ourselves to be open to those communities in more meaningful and just and equitable ways, we don't often talk about people who experience mental illness in that same breath. We're still scared. We still give them their groups in the side of the church so that they can support one another and then feel good about offering space. It's funny, the end of that story, and the story that we're telling is, we know it because Jesus sends the demons into the pigs and the pigs run into the water and everybody's really mad. And we know it for Legion and the herd of 2,000 pigs that drowned themselves. But the end of that story is actually the man wants to leave that community. And I don't blame him. Why in the world would he want to be around people who would shackle and push him away? And Jesus says, no, you have to go back. You have to share what God has done with you and for you so that they can experience it again. Because the community didn't want Jesus after that either. And so when we think about mental illness, and this is the first term, we can't think about it apart from stigma. We can't think about it right now apart from how we as a community of faith have feared people who experience certain mental illnesses, how we equate it with certain behaviors or ideas without actually knowing the people who experience it. I do my work because my grandfather deserved better. He deserved much better from the Presbyterian church that he experienced at that time. And so, as we're talking today about a variety of terms related to mental well-being, it's sobering to some extent to start with this idea of mental illness, because this should be the place where you can talk about feeling depressed. And this community should be open to that. This should be the place that you talk about feeling anxious or grief-stricken. And the community should be open to that. Heck, our sacred texts are full of people hearing voices. And those who hear voices in our midst today are sent to an institution, sometimes by our churches. We are so smart that we've become dumb to what it means just to relate and be compassionate and try to sit with people in the space that they occupy. And a lot of that has to do with the second term, which is mental well-being. Mental well-being, in my mind and in the way that I write and talk about it, has to do with this sense of this kind of ideal version of ourself when we go into a space. What does it take for me to feel well, emotionally, behaviorally, in my thoughts? And we have these idealized expectations. In my world, we call this normalization. It means that I'm like you, or I'm like this image of what normal is. And the sheer fact of the matter is that no one's normal, because no one knows what normal is, because everybody's different. So a great quote from a bunch of psychologists in the 50s that everyone is at once like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person. We are all human. Some of us attend Montview, and I attend Montview for this reason. And so well-being is when we get stuck in that everybody has to conform sometimes to this particular normalization. And we have this idea in our head about what normal looks like for us. For me, it's, to be able to get up and go into my basement office and to be present for my clients, to be able to write when necessary, to be able to speak when necessary. It means being able to relate to my spouse meaningfully, and we'll get to that a little bit later. It means being able to be a good dad to my children, whatever a good dad is or does at that particular moment. It means being able to see the world thoughtfully, but not devoid of my emotions, not devoid of the Spirit moving around me or my faith or my theology. And for all of that to happen at once is a pretty much never occasion. So that's why it's idealized. This is what I want to attain. So for those of you who are here before, I may have mentioned this, but I think all of us have this little wavy baseline that we live on. And I mean it's wavy because, it kind of ebbs and flows. There's some good moments and bad moments in each day. We have good moments and bad moments in each day, but they're manageable for the most part. And that little wavy baseline, at the end of the day, if we're taking stock, if we haven't fallen too far above or below that, we feel okay. And I think that's perfectly fine to have a lot of okay days. Not every day has to be some kind of smashing, resounding success. And so our well-being is our relationship to that line. Did we dip too far to below? Are we starting to narrow in on a particular part of focus of that? And when we do that, we lose perspective of the entire thing. And this is where our mental health comes into play. Our third term here. Our mental health is the judgments that we make relative to what we feel like our baseline should be. So when your knee hurts, you go see a doctor because your health is affected. I turned 50 this year, and for whatever reason, my stomach just does not want to digest the same spicy foods that it used to. So I was at the doctor this week going, what the heck? Why won't this do what it normally, why can't I have spicy tacos for lunch and for dinner? And so my baseline has to shift and change a little bit because an acute reason it dropped well below. Spent an entire night with indigestion, not being able to sleep. It was a pain in the butt, which affected my next day and my mental health. My physical health impacts my mental health as well. And so when we think about mental health, when you think about your health at all, we often think about doctors, we think about physical therapists, occupational therapists, we think about dentists, ear, nose, and throat, and we need to start thinking about mental health therapists as well. Because when your health chronically dips below your baseline, we need help getting back. So when you're thinking about your own mental health and you're thinking about when I want to access somebody to do something, what I want you to think about is that, okay, we have this wavy baseline, and sometimes in acute ways we drop below, but we bounce back up pretty quick. No need to see a therapist. Maybe you're talking to a friend or a partner or someone along that lines. But when we drop below and all of a sudden we can see it on the horizon, but we can't get back to it, just like you would go to an occupational or a physical therapist after a ski accident, you go to a mental health therapist to help you re-attain or bridge the gap between where you are and that baseline again. So thinking about mental health as that space where we are chronically underperforming. And what statistics tell us is that roughly 30 to 35% of us will at some point in our life have a period of over 6 weeks where we chronically underperform. It's a great time to have some help to get back to that space. That's pretty much what my job is to figure out why the new pattern took root and how do we interrupt it. Why the new story has become more meaningful than the old story. And how do we start telling that story of health or well-being again? And so that opportunity to sit with somebody who both has the skills, but also the wherewithal to stay in the pain or the suffering or whatever it is that you're experiencing at that time. To move from that chronic underperforming space back up closer to that baseline. And that leads me to kind of a final term here, which is mental fitness. So this one was new to me during the pandemic, and it came through some training I did as a coach. And mental fitness is that capacity to see from our baseline where we want to go next, but not necessarily know how to get there. And so we're intersecting, and we can relate to a therapist, we could relate to a coach. This could be something we do with friends or mentors or colleagues. There's a number of tools to use here. But the idea in part is that I need to stretch. But I don't know how to make the steps to stretch to what's next. I want to raise my baseline a little higher. So when we think about mental health as going to a physical therapist, we think about mental fitness as going to a mental gym. How do I prepare myself for the road ahead? How do I build resilience? How do I become more resistant to the griefs, the pain, the suffering in my life? How do I build excess capacity so that I can store energy for those inevitable acute downswings? All right, so those are my four terms that I want to kind of get out there, and stigma was just a bonus term to play around with. I've come to recognize over the last 20 months something that I call COVID PMS. It is something that I have noticed in myself, that once a month, every single month without fail, I'm a jerk. I'm an idiot. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I'm overwhelmed, and I take it out on the people around me. Sometimes it lasts a couple days. Sometimes it was yesterday. And I'm working on getting better at recognizing the signs and the symptoms. But you usually recognize it through the pain of how you interact with somebody else. And so I've just taken to calling it my COVID PMS. It's about 18 months old. Hopefully it doesn't last forever. But at the same time, we need to recognize when we've hit a limit. So I have a coach that I can talk to about fitness, about keeping myself aware of what's going on. I have an occasional therapist that I talk to as well when I get overwhelmed or get too far deep or down into an acute hole. I have a ton of colleagues and mentors, and we're going to talk next week about what it means to be socially healthy and socially well. So we'll talk a bit more about some of the research and other things there. I have, thankfully, a wonderful spouse who endures my lesser moments, and who, just like Ted Lasso has the memory of a goldfish, lets it affect her for about 30 seconds to 3 minutes, and then is able to bounce and walk away and just say, okay, that's his time of the month. So what I want you to begin to think about, or what I want you to begin to imagine, when it comes to overall well-being, is what do you need to surround yourself with? One, in order to maintain the baseline. Okay, because when we're at that baseline, well-being seems attainable. We're not judgy between our idealized and our reality. Our expectations don't overwhelm. So what do you need around you? Whether it's professional, whether it's, mentoring, personal relationships, friendly relationships, colleagues, whatever that is, take an inventory of those things. Because usually when we fall below the line, it means we're not accessing the resources we have. Okay, we don't do this alone. Our mental health is not ours. That's what's really weird about it. Because mental health is inextricably tied to relational health. And good mental health can often be found in merely meeting regularly and socially with 2 or 3 other people. It's all you need. A confidant. A confidant, not a Facebook grouping full of confidants. Numbers don't matter when it comes to that kind of help. Depth and quality matters. And so begin to think about, what is it that I need to maintain my baseline? Who is it that I need to maintain my baseline? And there's no shame in getting professional help. You twist your knee, you're going to talk to a doctor or an orthopedist. You twist your stories, you twist your brain. Why not talk to a therapist? It is as easy as a phone call, and as hard as a phone call. I don't underestimate the difficulty that many people have, and thankfully, people well below my generation, their conversations with their therapists are normal part of their dinner conversations. My therapist told me, or my coach did this, or my mentor said this, or I got connected over here. So thankfully, those younger than us, the stigma is lower. When it comes to accessing mental health resources, the stigma is still there around mental illness. And when I think about mental illness, I'm thinking about serious mental illness, bipolar, schizophrenia, clinical depression, stepping beyond things like generalized anxiety disorders to phobias, obsessive compulsive things. Those are what we talk about when we talk about serious mental illness. And those are the things that scare us because they feel chaotic and out of our control. And Lord knows the Presbyterian Church does not like to feel chaotic and out of control. I mean, the joke of John Calvin is decent and in order. And if someone shows up with a brain that's not decent and in order, we don't know what to do other than over-rely on what makes us feel safe. And so this is the interesting thing about brain chemistry. And the interesting thing, we talked a little bit in some of the earlier sessions about the autonomic system. So the autonomic system is the fight or flight system in our brain. And it is the most easily accessed and the most often accessed system in our brain. It's basically a direct line between your senses and this back part of your brain here that feeds and floods your body with energy in certain capacities, preparing for a threat. So a lot of folks talk about the saber-toothed tiger on the savannah or whatever that is or something like that, but we have plenty of threats nowadays. It's cars, it's guns, it's houselessness, it's financial insecurity, it's family safety, it's health, it's well-being, it's existential, it's immediate. If we can turn it into a threat, our brain likes to do that because our brain likes what? A safe body. Because a safe body means the brain continues to live. Somebody recharacterized all of this for us, is that basically our bodies are just a flesh and bone system to sustain a brain. This is just a big armored meat suit that we walk around with to protect our brains, because the brain is where all the stuff happens. It's where we happen. And so when our senses experience something that feels threatening, the brain says, And it engages a system that basically sends blood to your legs, so you're ready to run, shuts down your digestive system so that you can move energy elsewhere into your muscles and bodies. It drains the blood from your face. So when we talk about people being white as a sheet when they experience something scary, that's the autonomic system preparing to run. Because run is our first action. Generally speaking, it's flight over fight. And when what we're talking about is something that happens in hundredths of seconds. The moment we experience or believe something to be a threat, that system gets going. But what humans have is this big prefrontal cortex. This is what kind of, sort of separates us from intelligent or unintelligent, whatever word we want to use. There's a lot of different kinds of intelligence out there. But the prefrontal cortex is what interrupts and interprets. It says, oh, wait, that's not a threat. You know, I wrote about this a long time ago. I hate spiders with a passion. That's my thing, you know. It's almost in our marriage vows that, you know, Elizabeth takes care of spiders, I got all the other bugs. Because I will sit in the corner of the room and go, there's a spider going across the floor and I'm not moving until you get rid of it. And if I have to call her from upstairs, if I'm down in the basement, because, you know, this is the time of season when all the brown spiders are coming in the house to stay warm. Yeah, it's hell for people like me. But I remember when my daughter was two-ish, our oldest was around 2, and we lived in a house on around 17th and Cherry. We were renting, and they had this playroom in the back where we had, you know, a mat set down for her, and this was kind of, you know, she's probably a little younger than 2, so she was you know, standing on her feet and trying to keep herself from falling over stage, so she was still crawling mostly. And my desk was just outside the room where I could see her and watch her as I was working. I was in my PhD program at that time. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the floor when she was playing in the room. And it was shadowy, quick movement. So what did my brain tell me? Spider. I need to get my daughter and protect her. So I was up in a split second, picking her up off the floor, and looked down, and it's a dust bunny. Because I suck at cleaning. But this little dust bunny was going across, the little gray shadow. So my brain convinced me that there was a threat. And I reacted immediately to protect, because that's our natural thing to do. I want you to hear that. Protecting ourselves is not wrong. It's what we're built to do biologically. Being in a constant state of protection is deleterious to our overall health and well-being. Physical protection, threat detection, and threat response is meant to last at most half an hour. After half an hour, our bodies really have difficulty processing the chemicals, processing the hormones, processing all the stuff that's going on. And so if we're always seeing threats, and this is a lot of what PTSD happens, is that autonomic system doesn't get a calm down, the calm down switch is broken. And so our capacity to turn off the tense muscles, the blood, the ability to digest our food meaningfully, the hypervigilance and awareness of our surroundings, it lowers our baseline and it keeps creeping down into this chronic space. And so our ability to switch it on and off matters. And matters deeply. And the issue nowadays is that you can read the Post, you can read the Times, you can watch the news, you have 25 hours, 8 days a week of terrible news that you can access at your whim. And we can't turn off the vigilance. And we can't turn off the awareness. And that has a really huge, damaging impact on our bodies and brains, our minds, our personalities, our capacity to relate. And it makes us all mentally unwell. And so being able to detect threat appropriately. And as I've been trying to teach my kids, for one's 14 and one's 10 now, learning to respond rather than react. Because reaction is a threat-based relationship to something in our world. Response is threat plus prefrontal cortex. And so that capacity, we have to build that capacity. Again, going back to mental fitness, we have to practice. We have to find the tools we need that interrupt. The way that I talk about it with clients is that, most of our safety seeking is almost exactly the same. So what we do now as you did when you were a teenager. So if you were I got a threat, I get angry, I go slam doors, we still slam doors. We may do it mentally, we may do it relationally. May not do it physically like we did then. If we withdraw and isolate, we could, and basically what happens is those pathways get built in the brain really early, and we have a period of kind of hyperactivity from about 13 to 23-ish. And so those threat pathways become a superhighway really quick. And they get reified over time. We just keep building lanes onto it when we can't figure out how to build off-ramps. And we have to be able to build off-ramps. We have to be able to see game trails and country roads and wagon roads and build the off-ramp from that superhighway, because as we know as adults, slamming doors and isolating and getting defensive and yelling at other people is really not a helpful way to build the community we need to navigate the world. And evolutionarily speaking, we cannot navigate the world by ourselves. It is evolutionarily and biologically impossible to do it by yourself, to pull up your boots and make something happen. And yet we build a culture around the myth that this is the way we're supposed to do it. Forget the myth. Step away from the story. Build something new. All right, we've got 15 minutes. You've had plenty of time to develop and ask a therapist any question you want. Because what I want for you is to not be afraid to talk to somebody when it's time. To not feel isolated or alone. To feel as though calling somebody for help is as natural as breathing, because it should be. What you got for me? Yes.
So how is the best way to support a 22-year-old grandson with some mental illness, depression, anxiety,
Okay.
paranoid?
Sure. So what's a helpful way to support a loved one who is experiencing some serious mental illness? So besides acceptance, love, and compassion, well, to be able to do that is the first step, of course. what we know about particular things like that. So when we talk about serious mental illness in that particular regard, what we're talking about is an imbalance of brain chemicals. Not making enough of one thing or making too much of another thing, as well as having particular things that fire those chemicals off. So our brain sends some electrical things and it says, put a lot of this there because that's what we need. And sometimes our brains just don't do it in a way that allows us to connect with people in the way we want to. So yes, acceptance and compassion and commitment are important. I think normalizing medication. If for a lot of folks who experience, my dad is also bipolar. I have permission from him to share that publicly. For the longest time, he was medicated only for depression and not for bipolar, which was the wrong medication. Because what it did was it exacerbated manic states for him. And in exacerbating manic states, when he had a job, he could work 80 hours a week, he was fine. Once he retired, it became a lot of trouble. And so making sure that you're regularly advocating with doctors and psychiatrists and others who can monitor medication. And I would just say regularly check in. The question that I ask most folks is just, how is it with your life right now? Tell me what today looked like versus what you wanted it to be. And it's okay to lament. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to suffer with, as long as we don't suffer for or over-identify with the suffering. Because it's not only family that are impacted by this, but the person who experiences this, generally in our culture, is not accepted by their peers in the same way other people are, or accepted by their boss in the same way other people are, because of stigma and because of expectation and because of the way that we have a typified normal human behavior spectrum. And the further people deviate from that spectrum, the more it is we're going to isolate them because we're scared. Don't be afraid. Yeah. Perfect love drives out fear is what Paul says at one point in the Bible. Don't always believe him or like Paul, but it's a pretty good one-liner if we need it. Not that any of us can ever have perfect love, but that's a whole nother Presbyterian question for another day. Thank you. I appreciate that. Other questions, other thoughts? Yes.
I was just recently introduced to some of the work by Dr. Gaber Mate on trauma and the wisdom of trauma.
Yep.
And how we live in a culture of trauma that
Yep.
is trauma-inducing.
Yep.
And I was thinking about your comment at the very beginning about how our church cannot deal with anything that falls outside of order and
Sure.
normality, and how trauma-inducing that is just by itself, to deny the importance of emotion, to deny the importance of lamentation.
Yep.
And I was just thinking that it seems that there are some really deep organizational kinds of actions that could take place within a church that might address some of these issues further upstream than
Sure.
deal with an independent individual person.
Yeah, I think you're right. So the comment is around trauma and how trauma is experienced in community, I think, in some ways, but what I would call is systemic trauma. How a system becomes traumatized. and how a story becomes embedded in a system to perpetuate trauma, to keep trauma going. And I think there's a lot of new research around different things related. I mean, trauma is a huge thing right now. And make no mistake, many of us coming out of this pandemic are traumatized. And if we're not traumatized, we are definitely aggrieved. We are in the midst of a grief process because we have been shown how little control we have over anything in this world. And I don't mean governmental control, political control, all that garbagey stuff that we like to point to. We have no personal control, and that scares the daylights out of us. And so we live maybe not fully traumatized like someone with PTSD, with a deep kind of fear-based experience that impacts our personality, but we live with this baseline systemic trauma that, again, like I talked about, heightens awareness, makes us more vigilant, makes us less trusting of a stranger. Do you know, this was interesting when I was doing some studies on this a long time ago. Do you know who the people in the world are the most scared of crime? Like what demographic is the most scared of crime in this world? Elderly women. You know who are affected least by crime in this world? Elderly women. The least amount of crime impacts them. The largest amount of fear related to crime. That's what's been statistically shown over and over and over again. It's because we're fed a steady diet of fear-based stories. So much so that we lose hope. And when we lose hope, everybody becomes a threat. When everybody becomes a threat, we isolate. And when we isolate, we kill ourselves. We don't commit suicide. We don't die by suicide. We die by loneliness because we're afraid to reach out to other people. And the church should be the space that we reach out. It should be a trauma-free space where God is accessible just like each one of us is accessible, where hope and faith and love can restore those traumatizing systems that we live in. But to do that, we have to recognize that we are bathed in those spaces. And being bathed in those spaces, we either have to change the water, change the soap, change whatever it is that we're using that makes us feel comfortable with that. Because that's not who God calls us to be, especially together. Thank you. I wanted to attend, but at the same time, I don't know there was a question in there to answer, but we've got a couple more minutes. What I think when you bring your stuff to me, I think, wow, what courage it takes to share that story. What a privileged, sacred honor it is to sit with you in your pain and in your suffering and in your desire to find something new. How can I be some kind of vessel for healing in this moment? And if not healing, how can I just be there for you until you're ready to step into what healing means? That's what I think when I hear your stories for the first time. I'm not trying to figure out how to fix you. I'm not figuring out where you're broken, because we're all broken. We all need fixing. A great many therapists that I work with have the exact same. worldview and relational view. So what a wonder it is, and what courage it takes to try something different. And sometimes I think, gosh, this must be frustrating for them. This is the 15th time we've tried the exact same experiment. And the 10th time we've told this story over and over again. But you know what? They used that word differently this time, or they smiled when they said it. And I need to remind them, the first time you told me this story, you cried for an hour. And now you don't cry for an hour, you only cry for half an hour. And that when you said that part, you smiled a little bit. That shows change. It shows courage, it shows depth, it shows resilience, it shows possibility, it shows spirit. Anything else for the good of the order? You got to be Presbyterian at the end for a little bit to tie a bow on it. So next week we'll gather and we'll talk about social well-being. I alluded to it to some extent, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the research, because that's been a huge space of research recently, is what it means to us to be in community. And what it means, how it actually impacts our well-being when we're isolated or when we're lonely. And I don't mean, we'll separate alone versus lonely. Those are two different things. I'm an introvert, can stay in my basement all day, talk to a person for half an hour over breakfast and dinner, cool. I can be alone, but being lonely is a whole different thing. Being isolated, which is sometimes what our communities do to people that we're afraid of, is a whole separate thing. And they have deep, deep, deep physical impacts around longevity, around physical health and well-being, and a number of other, emotional regulation and a number of other things. And so next week we'll talk a bit about that. We'll talk about some of the research, because that's a huge body of research nowadays. And then the final week we're going to wrap things up. So we've got 2 more of these. We'll wrap things up and we'll try to figure out the integration of physical and spiritual and social and mental well-being, and what that might look like here, and how that might be possible here. Thank you for being here. I hope you got in the space outside as well. Blessings this week.